So our first presenter today is Charles Steinfield from Michigan State University, and the paper that he is presenting is called The Mobile Digital Divide Revisited, Mobile Phone Used by Smallholder Farmers in Malawi. Okay, so over to you, Charles.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to recognize first my co-authors who are all here. So Susan Wyche and Tian and Hastings Chiwasa. I saw him sitting out there too. And I also would like to recognize our sponsors for this research, our funders, the Michigan State University's Global Center for Food Systems Innovation, and also USAID. So we're doing research on the mobile phone ownership and use practices among smallholder farmers in Malawi. And so to get started, I thought it might be appropriate to put some context and say, why examine smallholder farmers and mobile phones? And in some sense, I know I'm preaching to the converted in here. All of you know about the many different applications that have been developed to serve the the agricultural context. In fact, in some of the demos we had here today, there were farmer helplines, and we've heard of text services for farmers. And it's no surprise. I mean, there's been we all understand the rapid growth of mobile subscriptions in developing countries, and I just grabbed from the ITU this nice slide that shows that most of the growth in mobile subscriptions over the last few years, in fact, is happening in developing regions of the world, not so much in developed regions. And we've hit the point where if you listen to the rhetoric about mobile phone penetration, it's there's a mobile for every person on the planet now, just about. We're almost at 100% subscription. And the reason why agriculture is so important is that it's a driver of the economy in most developing regions of the world. And we heard earlier today, and I have found some of the same literature that shows that, in fact, most of the food produced in developing regions is produced by smallholder farmers. And so we have to ask, well, now that they have mobiles, can they provide access to information and financial services and markets? And there are many applications that attempt to serve all of these kinds of needs. But to step back, I think it's important to recognize that the mobile phone subscription rates don't tell the whole story. In fact, mobile phone subscription rates, contrary to, I think, popular belief, do vary widely around the world. And there still remain a cluster of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that in fact have less than a 50% subscription rate, mobile subscription rate. And that doesn't even take into account urban and rural differences. And so on a countrywide average, it may sound great to say that there's 50, 60, 70% mobile subscription rate, but when you start looking at what that rate happens to be in rural areas where you do find, in fact, smallholder farmers, I think it's important to really question how useful mobile devices could be for providing the types of information that we're hoping to provide. And I don't think it's a surprise that many of the most widely known mobile services for farmers have occurred or originated in markets where mobile phone subscription rates are quite high. So Isoko originated in Ghana, which has over 100% subscription rate. And we know about M-Pesa and M-Kalimo and other services in Kenya and Reuters Market Lite in India. Well, these are markets where mobile phone subscription rates are, in fact, much higher than some of these other countries. So we have to think about this. And there has been some interesting research on what people do with mobile phones, much of that research done by people in this room, including some very detailed studies that take advantage of big data, tell us a lot about calling patterns in developing regions and even followed up with surveys to understand what people do with their phones. But generally, these studies haven't focused on rural farmers. And if I want to provide just a general overview of the conclusions from these studies, the finding is that ownership and use is very heavily correlated with measures of socioeconomic status. So wealthier people tend to have phones, and they tend to call more widely, they tend to have more business connections, and so forth. Another gap, though, in the knowledge base about smallholder farmer use of mobile phones is that relatively few studies look at gender differences. And what we do know from those studies that have been done is that women tend to be less likely to own mobile phones, and we heard some of that earlier today, and they're more likely to have to share a phone in order to use, to be able to make calls, and they're also less likely to make business contacts. So there are some gaps in our knowledge, and we wanted to address that. And to do that, we focused our research on Malawi. I thought maybe we might be the only presenters focusing on Malawi, and then earlier we had a nice paper on Malawi, and it set some of the context. What we heard was that, yes, Malawi is a relatively poor, landlocked country, heavily dependent on agriculture. About 80% of the population depends on agriculture. And about a little more of the context, about 75% of the farmland is devoted to maize in Malawi. And most of this is rain-fed, it's not irrigated. So these farms are really under a lot of stress, particularly from climate change. About 26% of the farms are managed by women, and some of that is a result of the population being decimated by AIDS. And like many other sub-Saharan countries, there's a tremendous shortage of extension workers, and so farmers are really in need of help. So this would be a great context in which to deploy mobile services for agriculture. And if you look at the GSMA statistics, they report that Malawi has about a 37% mobile subscription rate. Well, so we took a more careful look at this. And I want to just report a little on some of the findings from a survey that we did of smallholder farmers in the central part of Malawi. The area outlined in red there is the Dedza district. It's central Malawi, not far from Lilongwe. What we were able to do to try to understand the mobile phone use practices among smallholder farmers was to go into this predominantly farming area. We worked closely with the Malawi Ministry of Agriculture to identify what's called an extension planning area in Lintipe. And then we worked with the people in Lintipe in the agricultural office to identify sections. Each extension planning area is divided into sections. We chose 3 that were similarly sized, but were sufficiently rural, so not near Dedza town, and then randomly sampled households in these 3 areas. We ended up with about 190 surveys, 191 to be exact. We worked closely with the village leaders in these areas, in these sections, and got their support, so we were actually able to have quite a lot of success, and in fact, no one refused to participate in our survey. And so what we did was we developed an instrument that delved very deeply into mobile phone use practices. Of course, we got a lot of demographic information, what was on the farm, what they farmed, how many people lived in the household, and all sorts of information like that. But then we also asked if there was a mobile phone in the household, and if there was, we had this long battery of questions that got quite detailed about what they used their phone for, what features of their phone they used, and who they called, etc. And I just want to give you some insight into the findings. And the first thing that I'd like to tell you about is that don't always believe the mobile phone statistics that you read online, because it may not help you if you're actually trying to go out and do an intervention. We found 28% of the households had a mobile phone. And normally you don't see mobile phone ownership reported as a household level statistic. But when you take into account the number of people living in these households, in fact, phone ownership was about 6.4%. It's quite low. Now, of course, we could derive an estimate because we asked if people had SIM cards and if they had more than one SIM card. So we could actually derive an estimate of SIM penetration, and we did so. And that ended up being about just under 20% in our sample. So this gives you some estimate of the urban-rural divide in Malawi anyway, where you have a nationwide average that's almost double the percentage of the rural area, 37% to nationwide, but only 20% in the rural areas. And now, since past research has found that there is, in fact, a correlation with socioeconomic status, we looked closely at that and we gathered some indicators of socioeconomic status. And you can see across all these indicators, phone-owning households were significantly better off. They were more educated. You can see that in the upper left. They owned more assets. They had more livestock. Their size of their farms were larger. And they had other types of assets. They were more likely to have bicycles, radios. So it's no surprise. A phone is an asset, and those households that are better off have phones. We did also find, as we expected, that men were more likely to own phones than women. So we have a few different measures of this. Whether the respondent was male or mattered quite a bit. Male respondents had about 3 times as many phones as, were 3 times more likely to have a phone than women. If the household was headed by a man, it was almost 4 times more likely to have a phone. And across all the phones we identified in the study, about 2/3 of them were owned by men. And the way they used their phone was different. So there were similarities. Both men and women use their phones a lot to call friends and family. A lot of phone use is just checking up on how relatives are doing. But women were much more likely to call for health purposes and emergencies, and men were more likely to make calls for business and for farming-related purposes. And one interesting finding was that only men reported calling business contacts. Women did not report ever calling a business contact. So traders, for example, which could be a problem if the woman is managing the farm. Men called extension workers occasionally. Women rarely called extension workers. So these are important differences in use. We looked a little bit at measures of competence, how well people could use their phone, and there wasn't a lot of texting, for example. For example, men texted about 4 times in the previous week. Women texted once in the previous week. But then we asked some questions about whether they knew how to retrieve texts that they had received previously, or if they knew how to delete texts in order to make room in their mailbox, and or if they knew how to add contacts to their directory and so forth. And on all these measures, men reported significantly more likely to be able to do these things. And there were other measures of knowledge and competence as well, but the story is pretty much the same. So the last part that I wanted to mention in the closing minutes is we wanted to see if phone-owning households accessed information in different ways than non-phone-owning households. And so we asked about a variety of specifically farming topics, farming practices, pests and disease, livestock, crop prices, seeds, and weather. And we asked, where did farmers get information on these topics? Did they get it from their extension agent, from family, from community members, from the radio, or other. And what we found, I'll just highlight a few what I think are important differences in these statistics, and that is that phone-owning households were more likely to call extension agents than non-phone-owning households. So there is some value there. The low value use of the phone for crop prices, or extension agents for crop prices, is because that information exclusively comes from traders. Phone-owning households were significantly more likely to get information about weather and seeds from the radio. And this is probably a wealth effect. I mean, they were more likely to have radios. So we can see that these two go together. And the last one I'll just mention, there's a lot more detail in the paper. I encourage you to read it. We had farmers actually indicate that they had no source for these types of information needed to engage in farming. It didn't mean that they couldn't do it. Often they just said, I rely on myself. You ask about, well, where do you get information about the weather forecast? Well, I go out and I look in the sky, was a typical response. And I observe for myself. But phone-owning households were much less likely to report not having a source of information than the non-phone-owning households. So there were big differences in information access capability between the phone-owning and non-phone-owning households. So I'll close with just a few what I think are some discussion points that the survey brought out for us. So the first is we still find, despite the massive uptake of mobile phones around the world, that there is still very much a mobile divide, very much associated with socioeconomic status. We find that gender gaps are still very evident in both the likelihood of owning a phone, but also in the ways that phones are used. We think that the study reveals that it's important to start looking at how phones are used in order to understand how it might shape access to information, as the non-phone owning households really appear to face more challenges in getting information. And I think also the survey for us really illustrated the complexity of just this concept of phone ownership and phone use, how difficult it is to measure it in a way that is consistent from study to study. It took us a while to figure out how we wanted to represent this information. And it also shows the danger of relying on published phone penetration statistics. It might not tell you a good story about or at least it might not give you the insight into a location you're planning to do work. And so, just the final implication of the study is that we want to avoid over-reliance. If you're going into rural areas in these types of countries where phone penetration is low, avoid over-reliance on your thinking about the phone as the primary conduit for delivering information or for reaching smallholder farmers. You really have to look at other types of channels. So radio is still important, but also bringing people out into the community in, let's say, a digital green type approach is also something that we turn to in our continuing work in Malawi. So I'll stop there and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. So we have about 7 minutes left for questions. Okay, Josh?
Thanks, really interesting and nuanced work. So you find this correlation between people who have phones and people who have access to primarily agricultural information. And I guess I'm curious to just, and I know there isn't sort of the quantitative evidence, but
right.
To what extent you think this is just a correlate, right? That people who don't have phones don't have access to information versus some sort of, there might be, I guess the question is, would giving them a phone fix anything?
So, yeah, it's an excellent question and one that we can't answer with the data that we have. But if you want my gut feeling is that those differences happened before they got phones. So I think it seemed to me that those who were better off ultimately got phones, but they were better off for other reasons. It wasn't that the phones necessarily made them better off. But once they have phones, they become very useful. So it could be a kind of reinforcing effect. And they're able to even get better off than they were. We can't really answer the question, but that's my gut feeling, yeah. Yeah. One thing that we found, a question that we asked that surprised, and where the answer actually surprised us, we asked if people ever owned a phone, and we found that something like, I'm trying to remember the number, but it was almost like 40% of the non-phone owning households, somebody had at one time owned a phone. And then it was either stolen, or they lost it, or it broke, they couldn't fix it. And so it seemed as if, and I'm going to try to relate it to your question, but for me it also illustrates the challenge of figuring out, we can't think of that once people get a phone, they'll always have one. That did not appear to be the case in our sample. But I do think that when people had phones, they were able to use them for important things. So I would say yes, it would help them, but there are real challenges in getting phones to the kinds of households that we were looking at.
Okay. Well, Jonathan was first.
Thanks. It's very, very interesting. I liked the sort of the pause and the focus and the reflection a little bit on household ownership, and you said that this isn't something that we do very often, that you don't find many studies that use household ownership as the dependent variable or the thing you want to look at. Could you say a little bit more about what you think the implications for the rest of the community, the rest of the research community would be by switching to or emphasizing household ownership? I mean, I'm leaving aside what you mean by household, and that's a little shifty and all that. But are you implying that one phone per house or per household is enough? Is that what that measure would do? Or what else would it do if it didn't do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I didn't mean to imply that one phone per household would be enough, but just think back about how phone penetration happened in the United States and other countries. It was a household item, right? And actually, in my lifetime, it was, a household item for most of my life. And then all of a sudden, phones became a personal item. And so it's a kind of a big, there's been a leap. When we talk about how developing regions are leapfrogging, the fixed line to mobile, they didn't have to go there. Well, there's a lot of things that got leapfrogged, and the phone as the household item got leapfrogged too. And, there were a bundle of kind of affordances that we took for granted when there was a single phone in a household that we don't actually have anymore. And so I think it's actually worth thinking about in more depth about what it would mean to consider a mobile phone as a household item. So I know I didn't answer your question, and I don't want to say, yeah, that's how it should be, but I do think that if we thought a little bit more about that, we might ask some different questions.
Maybe your survey didn't include that information. I'm here.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
Yes, maybe your survey didn't include that information, but when doing your field work, did you observe socialization and sharing of technical information of mobile phone users with extended family and others, like what happened with the early take-up of internet by fishermen, farmers, and the like in certain parts of the world?
So we did do some interviews. We didn't do a lot of observation. So the survey was done with, people speaking Chichewa, and they would go, once the households were identified, they fanned out and went to all these households and just sat with the respondent from the household and filled out the surveys. And so, we didn't have an opportunity to do that kind of observation, although we interviewed some farmers, and we came away from those interviews getting a sense that there wasn't necessarily a lot of technical sharing, because, in some sense there were problems we found with the trust that farmers had with each other, and some of that was, just inside comments that they might make, like, I don't necessarily want my neighbor to know, how much maize I'm storing in my house, because then perhaps, they will come and ask me for some if, theirs runs out, or, it was issues like that. So I'm not sure that there would be that level of technical sharing, but we didn't observe that. Okay.
So I just wanted to continue upon what Josh left off.
Okay, raise your hand so I can...
So where Josh Blumenstock's question left off, there are certain variables, especially whether a household gets a phone or not, which are in some sense dependent variables. I mean, it might be dependent on, do they really want to get a phone? What is the, how much do they earn, and so on. Mm-hmm. So there are certain factors which, even if you do, I don't think you can even do an RCT to measure quantitatively certain dependent aspects. And one thing to piece apart in this work would be, there would be certain variables which are going to be specifically improving in a household because somebody got a phone. And there are certain factors that are going to be just correlated with the fact that they have a phone. And if you know upfront that variable X is going to be dependent on the fact that they actually got a phone, then it is possible to conduct a randomized control trial to quantitatively show that A led to B or something like that. Yeah. But if them getting a phone itself is a sort of a derived variable, no RCT is going to really show. It just happens to be two things that are just following each other. Yeah. I just wanted to make that as a comment.
Yeah, okay. No, so, I mean, it's a good comment. Of course, I'm not going to pretend that we did anything that would allow us to address this causality issue at all. And an RCT would need to be done. But the one thing that we asked that relates to your question is we did ask people if they would like to get a phone, or did they plan to get a phone, and we also asked, not just why they, whether they'd had a phone before, and if not, why not. But then we said, well, why don't you have a phone now? And so the majority response to why don't you have a phone was always money. It was always, I can't afford it, but I hope to get one someday.
Okay, so I have to interrupt because we're running out of time. So it seems that this paper had a very lively discussion. So I'm just going to ask you guys to take this discussion over into the